Well, welcome everyone. We have a sold out event this evening. So there will be people joining us, and I didn't fully realize that we're not in the formal webinar setting, but we are asking everyone to mute themselves and just stay on mute. There will be a Q&A, dedicated Q&A for the audience towards the end of the webinar. But welcome. So for those of you that don't know me, although I think everyone that's joined so far, I'm fairly familiar with your names and have come across you in one way or another. I'm Dr. Suzy Green. I'm the founder and CEO of the Positivity Institute. And I'm very delighted to welcome Professor Nancy Doyle to our webinar this evening. Nancy and I haven't actually formally met. We are aware of each other, and we have a very close colleague that we have a shared relationship with, I guess, in terms of Professor Stephen Palmer, who I co-authored a book, Positive Psychology, Coaching and Practice with. And I've been very familiar with Nancy's work for quite a while.
He actually examined my PhD.
He did tell me that, Nancy.
Yeah,
an examiner
yeah.
on your PhD. So I love Stephen. He's been one of the most incredible supporters in my career, Nancy. So I'm very grateful to Stephen. I'm going to introduce Nancy formally, but before I do, I just wanted to, I guess, my own interest in neurodivergence, neurodiversity. When I was training as a clinical psychologist many moons ago, in our child and adolescent period and placement, we were introduced to ADHD in children and adolescents, but at that stage there was no discussion of ADHD in particular for adults. So I've really been trying to, in the last 2 years, retrain myself or to educate myself around neurodiversity more broadly, neurodivergence more broadly speaking. But I've also come to realize through my education that whilst I haven't been formally assessed as ADHD, I definitely have I can relate to many traits and experiences myself. And I think that has enhanced my sense of curiosity. So I'm very much on a learning journey professionally, but also I would suggest personally. So I'm very keen to learn, Nancy. I'm very much, as I said, on my L plates or P plates. So I'm not proposing to be an expert, and I'm very keen to be here myself and to learn from you. But Nancy Doyle, Professor Nancy Doyle, is a chartered occupational and coaching psychologist. And of course, Nancy, you now have a dedicated division of coaching psychology in the British Psychological Society, whereas we still have an interest group here. I'm not sure whether we'll follow suit, but it's a great step forward for coaching psychology. Nancy is the founder and chief science officer of Genius Within, an award-winning B Corp and dedicated to neurodiversity and inclusion. Nancy has over 25 years experience in disability inclusion and is also co-founder of the Centre for Neurodiversity at Work at the University of London. She's known globally for her BBC documentaries, which I'd love to hear more about if we have time tonight, and Forbes columns, and she advises organisations including the UN, UK government, global leaders like Amazon, Microsoft, and Google. Is there anything I've missed? I'm sure, Nancy, I know it's such a very long bio, but is there anything there that you'd like to just highlight that I may have missed?
Sure. I'm neurodivergent myself. I am an erstwhile dedicated truant. And this year I was the witch in the local village pantomime.
I love that. Are you the good witch or the bad witch?
Oh, very much the bad witch. Yeah, I've been the good fairy 4 times, but I really found my groove with the bad witch.
That's another thing I can relate to.
Yeah. It feels like the part I've been auditioning for my whole life. I just absolutely loved it.
I'm hearing you. So we do have more people joining us as we progress, but this evening's webinar is going to commence with Nancy giving an introduction to herself and her work and sharing some slides, and very much in an educational format. Again, I'm very eager to learn. I also have formulated some of my own questions that I'm going to pose to Nancy, but we'll also, as I said, have an opportunity for the audience to pose some questions. you'd like to put that in the chat box. We have Jay, I didn't mention, we have the wonderful Jay Holscher from my team that's in the background that will be monitoring the chat box, although Nancy said she's very adept. And I also resonate with that, Nancy. It's something I can do similarly pretty well. But so there will be an opportunity for some Q&A. Yeah, I hope you enjoyed the session, and this will be recorded because it is a sold out event tonight, and we are aware that some people missed out on registering. Please let your friends and colleagues know, and we will be letting people know through our e-news and our social media that you can access the recording after this evening. But without further ado, Nancy, over to you.
Thank you. So just as a bit of an introduction into neurodiversity, I've just sort of put together some of my standard slides, if that's okay, if you'll
bring them up,
indulge me. And I've sent these over as well. You're very welcome to have them, and you're very welcome to use them. I don't feel precious about them. Oh, what happened there? I tried to share and then it went funny.
Oh, sorry, I was sharing. Did you want to share?
Oh,
or sorry, I should have asked.
Yeah, actually, would you mind if I shared myself? It's just easier.
Yeah, absolutely. Can you do that now?
Yeah, I can. There you are. I just need to move the black bar, which is in front of the bit where, there we go, the slideshow. All righty. So I just thought I'd do some neurodiversity essentials just so that we can kind of have a level playing field for what we're discussing. I'm very aware that people know varying amounts about neurodiversity, and some people come from very different perspectives. And I think before I go any further, I just want to say, if you're finding the whole neurodiversity field confusing and ambiguous, that is because it is confusing and ambiguous. It is not because you've missed some really vital information. I think I spent the first year of my PhD searching for the literature base that would make it all make sense. And it took me about a year to realize that doesn't exist. And, it doesn't make sense in many ways. There's lots of kind of conflicting and overlapping information. So I'll just clear up my position on neurodiversity, and you can feel free to critique and challenge me if you wish. So how did we get to where we are now? So the whole kind of, in the 19th century to the early 20th century, we started talking about neurodivergence in the way that we would recognize it now. We were describing functional difficulties medically. So instead of dyslexia, we had word blindness. Instead of ADHD, we had hyperkinetic syndrome. We started the word autism was first used in 1912 by Dr. Buehler and first described by Dr. Sukareva in the 1920s. Lots of very descriptive words that really identified that some people weren't able to do things that had become normal in society. And I want to emphasize that word become normal, because prior to the Industrial Revolution, we didn't have dyslexic people, because we weren't requiring everybody to read and write. Literacy is a functional adaptive skill. It's not something that's innate. So it wouldn't have mattered if 10% of the population were dyslexic. It simply wouldn't have come up. Similarly, with things like ADHD, we weren't requiring people to sit still all day. So ADHD didn't really exist. And regarding autism, we weren't requiring people to function in increasingly busy, noisy, smelly, intense city environments and work environments. So people who had an autistic thinking style would have been much more able to just be in quiet, calm places, and therefore to think better. So I just really want to emphasize that point, that a lot of what we call neurodivergent conditions exist in relation to the norm that we have set up for society, in which you need to be literate, numerate, able to sit still for hours, to do so in busy, noisy, loud environments. And also we have fine motor control requirements that we might not have had prior to the Industrial Revolution. In the mid to late 20th century, we started looking for functional neurological locations of observed difficulty. So, most of the research on dyslexia in the 90s, for example, was putting children through MRI scanners to find the bits of the brain that were broken. And the reason I've called that a fool's errand is because literacy happens in so many parts of the brain simultaneously. It is very unlikely that we would find one thing that made it all make sense. And similarly for ADHD, it's not likely that we're going to find one thing that makes it all make sense. These are complex behavioral adaptations of a particular thinking style that or multiple thinking styles. The reality is there's lots of different ways to be dyslexic. It might be that you are struggling to process phonological information. It might be that you're struggling to encode that into long-term memory. It might be that you're struggling to process rapid bits of 2D information very quickly. So there's lots of things that could be the issue. And so a lot of the theories that you see about where these different things come from are kind of all right, and none of them are right simultaneously, if that makes sense. Not one of them is a single unifying factor, but all of them have value in terms of people with those diagnoses are likely to fall into one of those categories of where it comes from and how it's happened. So we started using words like ADHD, autistic spectrum disorder, which is now really called autistic spectrum condition more and more, dyslexia, dyspraxia, anxiety. These were all words that we were using in the 20th century. And now we come to the 21st century, and we're really in a massive paradigm shift when it comes to neurodivergence. We've started looking for strengths, which is miraculous. I'm very pleased that we've started doing that. That has been my mission for 20 years. I kept thinking to myself, if 10% of the population are dyslexic, how is it purely something that's broken? Like, evolution isn't that bad. You don't keep making more dyslexic people if it doesn't confer any advantages or have any strength associated with it. Similarly, the 5% of the population who are ADHD, the 2% that are autistic, the 5% that have dyspraxia, the 5% that have dyscalculia, etc. Where are these things coming from, since they are so pervasive in the human experience, and not just in one country, across the whole world? So we're looking for strengths. We're noticing overlaps. So we used to think that ADHD and autism couldn't exist in the same brain. We now realize that it's double for about 2/3 of people. So that's quite a lot. We've started looking at the connectivity between brain regions rather than looking for one that's broken. We're looking at neurotransmitters, which facilitate some of that connectivity. And some very cool researchers are doing something they call transdiagnostic mapping, which is, rather than looking at dyspraxics in isolation from autistics, they're looking at neurodivergent people in general. And they're going, what do neurodivergent people have in common compared to neurotypical people, given that there is so much overlap now that the distinct categories themselves have almost become meaningless. So we're using this kind of neurodiversity paradigm, which is part of the social model of disability, which I'm quite happy to answer questions on. And what we need to do is scale and adjust our ways of working to accommodate a wider range of human capacity. That's really the mission of the Neurodiversity at Work movement. It isn't about applying a medical model of, something is broken, we need a diagnosis, now we need to fix you. What we're learning from the neurodiversity movement is that we created a very narrow range of human success during the Industrial Revolution, which is actually no longer relevant. So, literacy is becoming obsolete. The more we all have phones that we can talk into that will type for us, the more obsolete numeracy becomes. You don't need to sit down to concentrate all day anymore, because you can be on the move, because your files come with you in the cloud. You don't need to be next to a big filing cabinet full of paperwork anymore. So there are lots of ways in which the technology revolution is creating a very different world of work, in which neurodivergent people could be less disabled. And in fact, other people might become more disabled. A very fun game I like to play is imagining disability diagnosis titles for alternative ways of thinking. So imagine you had sedentary dependent concentration disorder for people that could only think when they were sitting down, or eye contact, overdeveloped eye contact social dependency syndrome for people that can only make friends if they look at them right in the eye. So, we could have a lot of fun with this, but that's possibly where we're going in 50 years. So we've got this situation at the moment where cases are rising exponentially, and I get asked about weekly, why do we have so many neurodivergent people now? And the reality is we're not changing the numbers. We've got more diagnosis and more awareness, but the numbers of people in the population still isn't changing. We're just getting better at diagnosing the people that are already there. So in the UK, for example, which is quite far advanced around neurodiversity awareness, we still haven't got anywhere near 5% of the population diagnosed with ADHD, which is what you would expect from population studies in the UK. So, whether we're overdiagnosing or not is debatable. We used to underdiagnose. We're possibly overdiagnosing people that might have other things. But what we're not doing right now is creating diagnoses where none exist. We're possibly misdiagnosing, but we're not creating. And I just always like to share this graphic. When we look at the whole population prevalence, and we include the various overlaps, and we think about the normal distribution of IQ and the number of people that are average and the number of people that kind of go either side of the average, both with high performing strengths and significant challenges, we're probably looking about 15 to 20% of the population have that kind of spikiness where they have some high performing abilities and some challenges. And what's included in the neurodiversity or the neurodiversity scope is everybody. The world is neurodiverse. That is a fact. It's a feature of the human species. It's not specific to these conditions. These conditions are neurodivergent conditions. They form neurominorities. And there's no one policing the boundary of who's included and who isn't. So I've put in colour the ones that are usually included, being autism, dyscalculia, dyslexia, dyspraxia, ADHD and Tourette syndrome. But there's absolutely no reason why we shouldn't be including people with mental health needs in that group. Things like anxiety, depression, bipolar disorder, also naturally occurring within the human species, very likely to happen. Not necessarily developmental, can be more transient or reactive rather than, something you're born with. We also acquire a spiky profile. When you have long COVID, your working memory decreases. When you have a diagnosis of multiple sclerosis, your working memory decreases, but your verbal skills do not. So, we can develop through chronic illness this profile. And we never talk about learning disability or intellectual disability, which I also think is an oversight in the neurodiversity movement. There is plenty of value in humans that have conditions related to learning disabilities, such as Down syndrome, and yet for some reason they're not invited to the party. So I want to invite people with Down syndrome and other conditions that affect intellectual ability to the neurodiversity party and embrace that as part of the natural variation of human thinking and part of the varied tapestry that makes up the community of humans that we have. So the neurodiversity movement is kind of represented by this cartoon in which I have a monkey, a giraffe, a fish, a flamingo, an elephant, and a lion standing in front of a tree. And somebody, either an examiner or a recruiter, is saying for a fair selection, everyone has to take the same exam. Please climb this tree. Now, obviously, we've got some winners here. The monkey and the lion are going to be able to climb the tree. The monkey may get eaten by the lion, but they can both climb the tree. None of the other animals can climb the tree specifically. But what we've done, this is about kind of mandating the method of communication rather than thinking about what we're trying to get across. So why would you want to assess whether someone can climb a tree? What's the point of climbing the tree? So let's think much more about the goal rather than the method of assessment. And the goal might be picking fruit. So if we're looking at picking fruit, all of a sudden we've got the giraffe on board, we've got the elephant on board, and the flamingo. They can fly. I checked. So by making our focus much more about what do we actually want to have happen, then we can reduce the disablement that neurodivergent people face. And one example that I always give here is is the use of interviews or the use of CVs or resumes. You know, we get very stuck on the ways that we do recruitment. So, for example, in my finance team, we don't interview people for my finance team unless they want to be interviewed. What we do is we send them a spreadsheet with some pretend management accounts on them that's full of holes. And we ask them to look at the spreadsheet and tell us what they think. And, you know, we want to know if they can find the holes, and we want to know if they can make sense of that spreadsheet. And we don't really care how they tell us about it. So if they want to send us an email or have a phone call or come in person, absolutely any of those methods of communication is fine, because the job involves processing numerical data and making sense of it. So that's kind of what I am talking about. And I think that might be a nice place to pause, actually, and just stop sharing. And I might come back for some more sharing later, depending on where your questions go. How about that?
Nancy, that's a fantastic introduction. Just before I get into the formal questions that I'd prepared, even 25 years ago when I was doing my clinical doctorate, there was a discussion at that time about the categorical diagnosis versus dimensionality. Where do you sit with that at the moment in terms of here in Australia? I did a one-day workshop with Dr. Jen Kemp, who you might be familiar with, who's doing some wonderful work here. She's a colleague of mine. And she was saying that here in Australia, we have one of the highest rates, I think, of autism diagnosis in the world. And one of the hypotheses is because you need that to get our National Disability NDIS support. And I guess the other thing is you hear, you know, on Instagram, social media, you know, in talking to people, you know, everybody's got, you know, ADHD now. You know, so how do you manage that categorical versus dimensionality discussion or debate?
Well, it's where's the tipping point, isn't it? You know, so for a diagnosis, I have to say I don't know the Australian rules specifically on diagnosis. But in the UK, in order to be diagnosed with ADHD or autism, you need to be experiencing significant difficulties in at least one area of your life. For example, school, work, relationships, managing your finances, or being part of society. So, you know, if you're not experiencing a significant, it's not easy to meet that threshold. Let's put it that way. That threshold is still quite a significantly high threshold. So I had a diagnosis of ADHD in my 30s, which I really should have had as a teenager, because I absented myself from school for 2 years.
Wow.
I missed 2 whole years of high school. So that's quite a high threshold to meet. So I think the question really is not why are there so many autistic people now? The question is, why do so many autistic people struggle significantly in everyday life and are so unwell? Because, you know, that there are a lot more people with an autistic kind of, if I think about my generation and the people who are having children and their children are getting diagnosed, and because the children are getting diagnosed, the adults are getting diagnosed.
Yes, that's right.
Guess what? We didn't get it from vaccines. But the children are significantly less okay than their parents were.
Yes. Because of multiple different factors, environmental factors.
And we don't really know what those factors are. You know, it could be pollution. You know, what we do know is that neurodivergent people have a lot of sensory sensitivity. That's in relation to the kind of, you know, your typical perceptive senses like seeing, hearing, feeling. You know, autistic people might feel things more intensely or significantly less intensely. They might hear things more intensely, but that's also related to the nervous system, to the digestive system, to the allergic and kind of autoimmune systems. There's a lot of overlap. And we live in an increasingly polluted, noisy, loud world where you can't shut off and you don't move your body very much and you don't go out in nature to decompress. So is it that we now need to have more people diagnosed because more people are really sick than they were in the 70s and 80s when I was growing up? So does that make sense?
Yes,
That's one possible answer.
it does. And so how does that social model align or sit with the, I guess, the medical model of where people may need significant support because of the struggles in functioning? How do
Yeah.
they fit together or?
Well, I kind of they can fit together.
Yeah.
There's no reason for them to be mutually exclusive. It's more a case of both and, I think.
Right. Yeah.
So rather than this or, it's not really either or, it's both and. So, because we're in a paradigm shift, aren't we? We're not, we were very much the medical model. The
Yes.
ideal we're moving to is a more social model, but the reality is right now we have a biopsychosocial model.
Yes.
Biologically, we can observe differences. We don't have a single test that can rule neurodivergence in or out yet. But what
Right.
we do have is increasing awareness about neurological differences and genetic differences. So those biological differences exist and they are real.
Yes.
And we have a social world that has changed, as I've outlined, and has got
Yes.
more intense and more frantic from a sensory perspective, but also has the potential to be more liberating from a design of work perspective. We're
Yes.
just not there
Absolutely.
yet. And
Yes.
so you've got that social environment, you've got this biology, and in the middle, you've got a psychology that's either handling that or not handling that, depending on the resources, and other factors that will be influencing how well they cope. So, I think that's the reality right now as we have a biopsychosocial model.
Yes. And I have so many questions, but I'm going to move to the questions that I did send through to you ahead of time. The first one relates to the myths, and I guess, or misperceptions. And I asked you, are there 3 common ones that you hear? And how can we address them to improve understanding and I guess do a bit of myth busting in our workplaces and communities?
Yeah, do you have it? I haven't got them in front of me. Do you have what I said back as my answers?
Oh, probably
Because I think
possibly
I sent
not.
them back to you. I definitely thought about that. I mean, the first one is the one that we've just been talking about, which is the why are so many people being diagnosed? And I'm not
Yeah.
sure that that is the right question. I think the right question is why are so many people ill? That for me is the right question. So okay, sorry, I'm going back through my emails trying to
That's
find
all
the
right.
other 2 that I thought of.
No,
I
I
remember emailing you and then I completely forgot to get the email in front of me.
I can't
Uh,
I can't see the responses, but I'm sure. Look, other people will come up
oh,
with.
no, I've got them.
You got them?
Oh,
Brilliant.
no, you're right. No, I haven't given you the responses. I definitely wrote them down somewhere. This is such an ADHD classic right now.
so
Uh,
it's so is, and I'm relating to you. But and anyone in the audience might like to pop into the chat if they hear common myths. I mean, yeah, the common one I think I hear most of is, oh, everybody's got ADHD. And when I've sort of raised it, even within my family, which I would argue there are clear examples of family members with ADHD or autism, or it's being referred to, I heard here in Australia, as ADHD. Is that the term,
yeah,
Nancy, of that
yeah.
correlation between autism and ADHD? Is that correct?
Absolutely, yeah, absolutely. And the transdiagnostic mapping stuff can't find. So what they've done in Cambridge University, and this has been replicated now in several other places, is they basically gave 1,500. They started by giving 1,500 children cognitive ability testing that tested the range of things that you would expect to be affected by one or more neurodivergent conditions. So
Right.
literacy, processing speed, memory, attention, rah 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 rah. And they profiled 1,500 kids, and all of these kids either had a diagnosis or they were getting special educational needs. And then they plugged all of their results into a rather sophisticated cluster analysis. And what they found was 3 clusters that bore no correlation whatsoever to the diagnosis that they had.
Wow, that's interesting.
Yes. So the 3 clusters they had were language difficulty, difficulty with hot executive functions, which is kind of risk filters, social filters, emotional regulation, and difficulties with cold executive functions, which is processing, planning, time management, organization, concentration. But what they couldn't do is use those 3 clusters to predict what diagnosis the kids had, or use the diagnosis to predict what cluster they would be in. So there was this huge kind of mismatch between what we think these conditions are and what they actually are. They then did neuroimaging, and the neuroimaging matched the clusters, but not the diagnoses. And what they've since gone on to do is look at the connections between the brain regions that are responsible for those things, specifically language and executive functions and sensory processing. And what they can find doing that is evidence of connection differences that neurodivergent people have that neurotypical people do not have, but they still can't tell the difference between the neurodivergent subtypes. So they can go, here's a neurodivergent brain, here's a neurotypical brain, but they can't do this is an autistic brain versus a dyslexic brain. So there is so much more. This is why I open with, if you're finding this confusing and ambiguous, that is because it is confusing and ambiguous. So
would you say it's from I guess an academic research perspective, there's definitely additional research that's happening, or it's being fast-tracked in this area? Would you say that or not?
There's still a lot more research that's happening. I mean, these Cambridge people are upsetting the apple cart left, right, and centre, because, you know, I mean, I've tried this myself. You can't get research funding. Sure. The thing to look for is Duncan Assel and Jolie Holmes's work. They did a review in 20, I think they published it in 2021. But if you search for those names and transdiagnostic mapping, you will find it. But yeah, they're really, study all of the research grants prefer to focus on one condition at a time.
That's been half our problem in clinical psychology, generally speaking, I would argue.
Totally. So these guys are really upsetting the apple cart. But what they found, I think, is super interesting.
Yeah, fantastic. And I guess, does that also, you know, doesn't aid the confusion that's out there? And, you know, again, just in my own life and personal life, talking to people, like, I've got this trait, but I haven't got this trait. Like, you don't fit neatly into any specific. Yeah, it's interesting.
Yeah, 100%. And, you know, Professor Amanda Kirby, I don't know if you've ever come across her work. She's got a really excellent...
yes, I have heard of her, yes.
Yeah, she's got a really excellent model for explaining that. She's kind of got that, she kind of calls it balls in buckets. So if you've got the literacy bucket and the numeracy bucket and the attention bucket and the, you know, sensory overwhelm bucket, and let's say you don't have enough balls in any one bucket to reach the threshold for diagnosis, but you've got a bunch of balls in every single one of those buckets, you know, that too is significant. So there's lots of different ways to do this. And I think, you know, our diagnostic criteria and the interpretation of our diagnostic criteria is basically built on sand, is what the transdiagnostic mapping people are coming up with. You know, it's conjecture, it's bias. We already know that diagnosis is incredibly biased through the lens. It's framed through the male lens entirely. It's framed through a white lens. You know, there are in the AQ10, which is the standard 10 questions for identifying autism that's used in medical research and clinical research. One of the questions is, I like to collect details about things, for example, cars, planes, and birds.
Yes.
Now, how many girls are going to say yes to that question?
Yeah, that's
not
true.
As many as boys, right? Exactly. There are more boys that are going to say yes to that question than there are girls. And now, and particularly if you're autistic, because if you're autistic, you tend to interpret things literally. So if you collect lots of details about bees, but you're not collecting them about birds, planes, or trains, you might say no.
That's right.
You know, so we've got these kind of biases built into diagnostic criteria all over the place. It's really flaky, flaky.
I do find it really interesting, though. Like, I guess for me, I've collected research in positive psychology, and, over the years I've was quite obsessive. And in fact, I've referred to, I'm trying to think of the author's name, but the research on Robert Vallerand, his name is, on obsessive passion. So he's done a lot of work on passion, and he's differentiated obsessive passion versus harmonious passion. And obsessive passion has been shown to detract from psychological well-being. And I could absolutely say I was obsessively passionate in the early stage of my academic career, driven purely out of anxiety. But I've thankfully moved to a harmonious passion now, Nancy. But I'll move on, because I want to leave some time clearly for participants.
Can I, before you do,
yes.
Can we at some point come back to the other myth, which is that ADHD is all trauma?
Yes,
because
please.
Gabor Mate is going around singing that hymn song, and I'm starting to have enough of it.
Yeah, no, I would love to hear your perspective on that, because you're right. I actually heard him speak here recently in Sydney. I've been reading his book. I've been trying to make sense of that myself. But again, I'm not an expert in this field, so I would love your perspective on that.
Well, he says things like, we haven't found one single gene to identify ADHD, but we haven't found one single gene to identify eye colour either.
Right.
So, how about shush? I mean, the other thing is, not all ADHDers are traumatized, and not all traumatized people have ADHD. There
Yes.
isn't, so I'm always suspicious of any scientist who says this is all this or all that.
Right.
So his very premise of ADHD is all trauma,
yes,
for me, is just already, that's got my red flags going. So
right.
Undoubtedly, there are some traumatized people who have been
Yes.
erroneously diagnosed with ADHD.
Right.
And there's probably some ADHDers who have been erroneously diagnosed with PTSD, because diagnosis is flaky. But what we can clearly see is that not all ADHDers are traumatized, and not all traumatized people have ADHD. There's multiple responses to trauma. What is the case, if you look at the research, is that trauma exacerbates ADHD.
Right.
So if you have an ADHD, one of the things we talk about in genetics is obviously the big ye olde nature nurture debate,
yep.
which isn't really a debate anymore, because it's quite clear that it's both.
That's right.
So you can have, there's about 27 genes that have been identified that relate to ADHD, with a big overlap with autism, obviously, and other things. But those 27 genes kind of create the conditions for ADHD to emerge. And then the conditions that cause the symptoms to be at a level where they meet the threshold or not could well be exacerbated by trauma.
Right.
But define trauma as well.
Yes. Well, that's an ongoing debate itself, isn't it? So
yeah. So I think all that's happening with his kind of soapbox that he's on is he's just getting lots of attention because people really don't want to believe ADHD exists. I don't think it's a helpful argument.
no.
And even if it was true, so what? What are we doing about this?
Yes,
We're driving a debate about whether something exists or not. And what we should really be doing is going, okay, we have a bunch of kids in school who can't concentrate. How do we support those kids, whether it's PTSD or ADHD?
Yes.
What's the right way to support a kid who can't concentrate when they need to concentrate? How do we do that? That's where our attention should be. So there are a number of, on the genetic basis, rubbish. On the diagnosis basis, rubbish. And on the very point of moaning about it all the time, stop. Let's start looking at what we do to support people instead of basically gaslighting people. One of the things that's been really interesting for me as an individual is to have an ADHD diagnosis in my 30s, having had a very, very difficult time as a teenager, and being misdiagnosed in that era with all kinds of things. I was misdiagnosed with eating disorders, with anxiety, with various things, all of which became true because of the ADHD, but it wasn't, they weren't the right diagnosis. But I have raised 2 children. My children are 19. I've got twins. And one of them also has an ADHD diagnosis and only really barely meets the threshold for things being compromised. So what I'm looking at is an ADHD brain from my genetics that has had a much less traumatic environment to grow up in.
Yes.
Yeah. He's had, he's wanted for nothing. He's a very privileged little white boy growing up in the villagey suburbs of England, an hour's commuting distance from London, with 2 parents who still love each other and are together, and having not ever had to want for anything. And his ADHD expression is so very different from mine as a teenager. And that doesn't mean that my ADHD is a construct of my parents' marriage and various other things that happened. It means that my symptoms were exacerbated by not having the same stable home life that he had.
Yeah, it's so interesting, isn't it? And I think, and I, in my little knowledge of this, or my growing knowledge of this, the idea, and I've read particularly for women that have been diagnosed with anxiety. And if I think about, I left school at 16, and in fact, many people on the call today will be familiar with Professor Anthony Grant, of course, who the late great Anthony Grant, Nancy, that you'd know. He left school at 15 with dyslexia, and these, I guess, if I'm using the correct language, masking behaviors or accommodations or adjustments, is that the correct language? Like, I've certainly found workarounds in my life, and I've been able to utilize those strengths, like those superpowers, I guess, that I do have, which was confusing at first, because I thought I don't have problem concentrating. Like, I'm easily distractible, but I've got hyper focus as well. But not learning about this now until my 50s has required me to look back on my life, in a sense, and a life review, which I think a lot of people at perhaps mid-age at least are doing. And I've realized that I've made a lot of I've made a lot of adjustments. Like, in today, now, with the knowledge that we do have, what can we do to support people that are thinking, oh, that's me,
Yeah, well, the fastest growing demographic of diagnoses is middle-aged women.
Right.
Yeah. So with my cynical hat on, is it any wonder that we're now getting grumpy about how many people are getting diagnosed? Like, oh, but and that your experience is quite common, a reappraisal of your life, things that you assumed were personality defects actually turn out to be cognitive differences.
Yes.
And then you can kind of forgive yourself and give yourself a little bit of grace for the things that you find difficult. And rather than trying to fix those things by working harder, you accept an accommodation or a workaround or a strategy to make your life more easy, because you just realize there's no point in banging your head against that brick wall. It's not ever going to be easy for you to do X, Y, or Z. So it can be very healing. It can be very cathartic, very vindicating, to be diagnosed when you should have been or could have been as a child. But there's also a little bit of grief. Oh, I always wanted to be X. I always wanted to be Y. I never thought I always wanted to be an engineer, but I never thought I was bright enough, so I didn't go to university. We get a lot of that when we diagnose adults. It's like, this is what I always wanted to do, but turns out I wasn't clever enough. And you go, actually, yeah, you really were. You just weren't very good at sitting exams, or you were pretty useless at coursework. One of the two usually. So yeah, so this is why coaching is so good. So this is people bring this into coaching, and within the coaching conversation, you can do some reintegration of ambition, of goals, of what you want to do, what your professional identity, and where you want to place your strengths and your talents and your genius within, if you will. Where is your work part of your genius within, or actually could you be doing different things, more things, less things, more targeted things? It's a great way to address that issue. Coaching is you know, my fave. I've always loved
Yeah.
coaching. The only reason I'm a coaching psychologist, the only
I want
reason
to
I
give
was an
it
occupational psychologist is because there wasn't a route to coaching psychology when I started my stuff. But yeah,
right. I
yeah.
do want to give a plug for Nancy's book, which we will I think on the slides there's a discount code, Nancy, too, isn't there? And your new book, Neurodiversity in the Workplace. Is that the correct title?
Yeah, I don't have discount codes for the books. I've got a
Right.
discount code for the Genius Finder, which is
Oh, brilliant.
yeah, it's my online tool that I developed. It's got it's got 20 years of coaching advice synthesized into it. So it's like all of the strategies that my clients have created that
Yes.
have worked for them. I have synthesized into a kind of online learning platform, and it's behind a very straightforward psychometric assessment of where your strengths and challenges are in the workplace. Very specific to the workplace, very context
Right.
specific. If you changed your context, you should do it again. But people can log in and go in and out of it for a year. But yeah, so it basically pairs the problems that you have with the solutions that my clients have found helpful. So it's really helpful for coaches that are working with neurodivergent people without necessarily being experts in neurodiversity, because it
Right.
will give you boundaries of this is something you can focus on. This is something that people can change. One of the other things that happens in a late diagnosis is a kind of flip into learned helplessness. So a kind of, oh, well, there's no point in trying then. So I've got this diagnosis, so there's nothing I could do.
Right.
And that's one of the things I wanted to address with the Genius Finder, because there is always something we can do. We can't necessarily grow a skill that we might have never had the cognitive underlying capacity for, but we can grow workarounds for that skill.
Wow.
And we can also create the best conditions to help us when we're performing that skill. So, you know, if you know that you find it difficult to concentrate in certain environments, you know, how much can you modify your environment? Can you, if you can't modify your environment loads, can you put noise cancelling headphones on? Can you burn a candle to create a scent that allows you to feel settled? Can you play music that does? Can you set, you know, there's things you can do to support yourself. And I think I want people with fresh diagnosis to have access to all of that information quite quickly, so that they don't get stuck in learned helplessness.
Right. And what's the balance in the UK that you've seen? We've certainly seen interest here in corporate Australia in providing coaching, and actually we've had specific requests saying, do you have coaches that are able to do coaching for neurodivergence? But we've also been hearing that organisations are trying to, I guess, educate more broadly within the workplace around neurodivergence. Like, what's the balance that you've seen in the individual, I guess, taking responsibility in some cases where there hasn't been much acknowledgement of it and having to, you know, manage themselves in their environments, versus the organisation really trying to come to the party and support people?
I mean, it's a complex psychology, that it's not easy. I think the balance was, historically, the individual has to change to fit in.
Yes.
It's becoming more the organization has to adapt to accommodate, but a lot of that is being kind of executed in a not very helpful way, if I'm honest.
Mm.
I used to see a lot of managers who didn't care, who were like, oh, well, in my day, people were just thick and they didn't pass their exams and we didn't call it anything and they just didn't
Yeah.
have this job. So you'd have that kind of very persecutory style. What I'm seeing more now is the rescuer phenomenon. So if you think about the Cartman drama triangle, transactional analysis, you've got the neurodivergent person as victim,
Yes.
and they used to have a persecutor. Now
Yes.
they've got a rescuer. And actually, if you know your transactional analysis well, you will know that the rescuer role is no better than the persecutor role. It is not helpful. It is just as toxic. And what it means is that person is still a child in the relationship. They don't get get to grow. They don't get to learn something. They don't, and that means that they don't get to progress. And next time there's a redundancy round, they're probably first in line. So it's not long-term protective for them to be rescued at work. It's a short-term fix, and it lasts as long as the manager's goodwill lasts. And when the manager's goodwill runs out for whatever reason, then that person gets the rug pulled from underneath their feet. So I think that the misconception around accommodations is it means doing part of their job for them.
Right.
Doesn't mean at all. Accommodations means enabling someone to be able to do their job. The standards of the job, the speed of the job, the effectiveness of the job, the efficiency, the conduct within the job is still stands. Being autistic or ADHD doesn't mean you're allowed to lose your temper at work and be rude to people. Being dyslexic at work doesn't mean you're allowed to send out marketing material or official letters that are full of typos. It does not. It means we will help you to stop doing those things. It doesn't mean you are allowed to do those things.
Right. Interesting. And from a coaching perspective, as you know, we often utilize in our leadership coaching, whether you call it a three-way or a coaching triad, neither term is particularly the best. But is there a role there for the coach, an educational
100%.
Role in working with the leader?
100%. I've made up this term co-coaching, which is where you coach both the manager and the client at the same time.
Right.
And I kind of started using that term about 15 years ago when I started Genius Within. I went to see someone for a workplace needs assessment. And in a workplace needs assessment, you always have you have to have the employer and the employee, because you can't get a good handle on what's possible in that organization without speaking to both parties. So I asked the employer in this case the miracle question. You know, what if a miracle was to occur and this whole process was to work perfectly, what would your employee be doing that he isn't doing now? And he said, "Oh, I just need him to play the game." And his employee is an autistic IT person. And I'm sat there thinking, he doesn't, do you say that to him? You use that language with him? Oh, you do? Oh, okay. So I know where this is going wrong. You can't say things like play the game to this employee. He's taking you literally, and he's wondering why you want him to play games at work. He thinks you're a nutter, by the way. So that's why this isn't working. And then it took me like 5 minutes to get me to tell him what he meant by that. So I was like, okay, so let's work this out. So play the game. What's an example of play the game? If someone was playing the game, how would you know? What would you see? What would you hear? Oh, he'd be more proactive and less reactive. Yes. I'm like, I still don't know what you mean. I still can't interpret that as in a behavioral language that I can give as an instruction. Like, I still don't know what you mean. And if I don't know what you mean, I can bet you 100% that neither does your employee. Absolutely. So it literally took me 5 to 10 minutes to get this guy to tell me that they had a weekly meeting, and what he wanted him to do in the weekly meeting was come prepared. So what he meant by prepared was to bring an A4 page with a bullet point list of tasks he'd done last week, and an A4 page with a bullet point list of tasks he was going to do the following week. That's all he wanted.
Right.
But that was hidden behind language like prepared, be proactive, play the game. And so in that context, you need both of them in the room.
That's right. Exactly.
Because it's the communication between the people that's going wrong. So what I did is I had them both in for coaching, and we worked through like 5 or 6 or 7 examples like that. And slowly what I did is hand over to the employee the questions I was asking to get the manager to be straight with me and to give a clear, tangible, non-ambiguous answer. So the coaching shift was to get the employee capable of asking those questions. Yeah, not necessarily to get the manager better at explaining. That's kind of a byproduct.
That's
the
right.
Manager might, because what I need is that employee to be able to do that the next time he has a manager. Yes. If I only give the skills to the manager, the employee is still disempowered. So I need the employee to understand that it's okay to ask a question like, can I have an example of that? Is there a time where I've done it before? What would you see or hear? What would I be doing or saying? To get them to to use those clarifying prompt questions to get the information they need. That's a very long note for a
absolutely.
short.
And I think I'm just wondering, well, I guess I know from experience, sometimes having that conversation, particularly with a new boss, in terms of, and even in a coaching context, it would be like questions I'd be asking a coach is, well, how can you get the best out of, how can I get the best out of you? How can you get the best out of me? And for someone that does need, to clarify, like this is again relating to me, I ask a lot of questions. Curiosity is one of my top character strengths as well. But for some people, I've found leaders get frustrated by those questions. But I'm wondering if you frame it up early on by saying, in terms of getting the best out of me, I need, clear instructions or clarity around language, like just framing that up at the beginning of the relationship, if possible, whether that might be helpful or not.
Absolutely. But I think the goal here is always that the neurodivergent employee knows how to handle those situations.
Yes.
I get that employers need to make accommodations. They do.
Yes.
And that, what employers really need to do is start thinking about universal design and how can we have workplaces that are more human-centered in terms of the way humans think and perform. That would just be better all round. And things like provision of assistive technology and provision of standing desks and stuff like that is all good. But in terms of where the power and the agency is, we need the employee to have that power and agency.
That's right.
It's not as simple as your manager, has been on a training course, so I now know how I will have to speak to you in order to get the best out of you. It's the employees going, right, I know what I need in order to perform, and I'm going to make it my business to get that. I was actually having this conversation yesterday. I was doing some training with the Division of Occupational Psychology up in London, and I had someone who worked for the fire service, and she said, well, the trouble with the clarifying questions is, we operate a very hierarchical command and control structure, which is what you actually absolutely need in a crisis situation, like a fire. So, how does it work in that environment? And I said, well, it probably doesn't. But that's not the point. When you're actually live with a fire, everybody is doing things that they have rehearsed a million times.
That's right.
That's how you train a firefighter.
Right.
You get them to rehearse things until they become automatic. So you're not going to have the clarifying questions in that situation. And in fact, if someone is given an ambiguous instruction in that situation, you want the clarifying questions, because this is a high risk, safety critical situation, and you do not want ambiguity. So you probably won't get very many, but if you do get some, they're probably vital. What you want is the clarifying questions in the training and in between times, so it's very context dependent, isn't it?
Absolutely. Now, I'm just mindful of time, and there has been a question by Marianne Power, who's one of my wonderful colleagues who's on the call today. Marianne's a clin psych. She's a specialist in neurodivergence as well. And Marianne has said, thanks so much, Nancy. Suzy, it's very helpful. I'm curious to hear more about what you're discovering around PDA. What does PDA actually, what's that acronym, Nancy?
It stands for pathological demand avoidance.
Oh, right. Yep.
Yeah, which is...
And have you seen that question? When considered through a diathesis stress lens, do you see its expressions emerging across a spectrum? It's a big question, but what do you think?
I don't know what you mean by diathesis stress lens. So you might have to explain that.
That's stress.
But yes, I do. Yeah.
Yes, sorry, you go.
Does Marianne want to come in and explain?
Yeah, Marianne, are you there? We'd love to hear from you. Can we, I don't know if we can unmute her or not. And
Marianne has also pointed out that the pathological demand avoidance is the clinical term, but in the community, people prefer pervasive demand for autonomy. And what PDA looks like is somebody who finds any kind of demand, be it an instruction or a rule or an imperative, so anxiety inducing that they will have a fight or flight or freeze response to that instruction. And a demand could be lots of things. It could be a teacher telling you what to do, or a parent telling you to come downstairs or eat your dinner, or it could simply be the expectation that you leave the house at 8 o'clock every day to catch the bus. It could be, it could be a demand, could be lots of things. But yeah, I do see its expressions emerging across the spectrum, and I can historically diagnose myself with it as a teenager. 100%. I had PDA. But yeah, I don't know what you mean by a diathesis stress lens. I always.
Yeah, that's that internal, I guess,
vulnerability.
That's
like lingo, isn't it?
Yeah, it is. It's been a while since I've come across that term used recently, but it's that internal, I guess, vulnerability, and where it interacts with the environmental stressors. So you've already got an internal vulnerability, and then the stressors, I guess, enhance that. I think is what Marion's saying. She said, or pervasive desire for autonomy in the community. She says she can't unmute for some reason. I don't know why.
I mean, PDA is a particularly difficult condition to work with, and to experience, actually. People who have PDA tend to be much maligned because it looks like refusal to comply.
Right.
So, from an educator's perspective, it often looks like refusal to comply. From many parents' perspective, it looks like refusal to comply. And it is usually initially treated as refusal to comply, which just compounds the problem, because the child is chastised for, being badly behaved and for behavioral issues. But typically, someone who is fighting or flighting or freezing from a demand is not choosing that. They are experiencing an intense stress response, a very heightened arousal that they have very little choice over. So, it's very difficult to work with that. You have to think about how to create choice and autonomy in every interaction. That person has to have as much agency as they possibly can. I haven't had a boss since I was 25 years old. What can I say?
Either have I, Nancy. See, there's more ticks here happening for me.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah.
And look, I know we are on time pretty much, but does anyone else, have you got a few more minutes, Nancy, if anyone has a burning question? Does anyone have a burning question? It seems as if I can't take you off mute, but if there's a burning question you want to put into the chat box. The other question, I guess, for me and for the audience, Nancy, would be, what recommendations besides your wonderful books, which I can't recommend too highly, and we've just been having a discussion around how do we get Nancy out here for a live event, so hopefully we will make that happen.
Time it with the Melbourne Grand Prix. That's how you do it. I am all in. If you can time it with the Australian Grand Prix, I am there. 100%.
And I'd also like to say we've got the International Pos Psych Congress here in Brisbane. Again, for anyone that's interested in going, it's a marvelous opportunity to attend an IPA Congress here in Australia in July. But we haven't been having conversations in Pos Psych about neurodiversity either. So we'd love to see you as a keynote at one of those upcoming conferences, Nancy.
I would love to do that, particularly if you could time it with the Australian Grand Prix.
And so any other recommendations in terms of upskilling yourself, educating yourself on this evolving field?
Yeah, I've got a couple of other book recommendations, and I have put them on my slide, so you can send them out. Ludmila Praslova, who is an American IO psychologist, has written a beautiful book called The Canary Code.
Yes, I've had a few people recommend that to me.
Yeah, it's absolutely fantastic. And it's very much about kind of workplace culture, what neurodivergent people bring in terms of psychological safety and authenticity and transparency. And yeah, it's very much aimed at the organizational level, and it's very, very useful, just generally. And then there's also a book by someone called Neurodivergent Rebel. It's actually by Lyric Rivera. They run the handle Neurodivergent Rebel.
Okay.
And that's called Neurodiversity Rising. And that's much more helpful at a kind of everyday team manager work relationship level. But both of them are both of those books are very, very practical. And as well as the coaching book, I've also just published a book called Learning from Neurodivergent Leaders,
Oh,
which is
brilliant.
it's kind of a critique of neurodivergent. It's kind of critique of leadership, actually, from a neurodivergent perspective on what we know about leadership. And it's got some, you know, this whole kind of the coaching leader, the servant leader,
Yes.
and just basically how badly those models serve women, and neurodivergent people and anyone else that has been minoritized. You know, we already overplay those hands. Those hands are
Yes,
already overplayed.
that's
That's
right.
not the leadership coaching we need. We do not need coaching on how to be more servile. We
No.
need coaching on how to be more bold, how to be more
Sure.
confident in our decision making, how to have better boundaries, how to stick to our values, how to choose allies from whom we can take feedback and not be blown about by the feedback of absolutely everybody we come into contact with. That's the leadership coaching we need, and that leadership coaching is very often lacking in the literature. So the whole book is about is aimed at coaching leaders who are minoritized in some way through a process of identifying their leadership self, thinking about how they sustain themselves and don't fall into rescuer traps, and then how do they kind of create that around them. But it's not just my stories. So it's a blend of academic writing and autoethnography, with worksheets in it as well in each section. But also peppered with stories from other neurodivergent leaders who are doing different things to me. So some who are community leaders, neurodivergent rebel is in there, some who are corporate leaders, some who are academic leaders, some who are church leaders, you know, just a variety of different leadership roles, also telling their stories.
Wow. Well, thank you so much, Nancy, for joining us and sharing your knowledge and wisdom this evening. For anyone that's still on the call, if you want to show some thanks to Nancy in the chat box, that would be wonderful. And we do hope to see you here again, Nancy. And your work is so important at this particular time on the planet. So continue to do wonderful work. And yeah, don't forget about your Australian friends out here. We'd love to see you.
Amazing. No, I don't forget about my Australian friends. By the way, the person who had the question about PDA, if you're still on the call,
Yes, Marianne.
Christy Forbes, I think, is the best.
Yeah, she's great.
lead.
Yeah, I can
Yeah.
unmute.
We can hear you,
Yeah.
Marianne.
You can hear me.
Christy Forbes's
You
work
can see me
is
too. I'm recovering
absolutely
from
gold.
hysterectomy, so I've had myself off on. I'm in bed. But Christy Forbes is beautiful, and thank you for that response. I think the answer was yes. Yeah, I'm definitely seeing with the stress model, it's really interesting. The PDA seems to spike up, and then you get somebody in a low demand environment, and a lot of the features that are so problematic drop away. So I was just curious to hear. Yeah, thank you.
Low arousal training is good. And what Christy Forbes does, which is the radical acceptance idea, is just basically always holding the benefit of the doubt and giving that person the benefit of the doubt in every opportunity, which is a very peaceful way of going about it. But it means that whoever is the caregiver has to really buffer from the rest of the world who do not have that same, so it's quite stressful for the caregivers. But one of the things I really like about Christy Forbes's work is that she's doing that for her children, but she is also a PDA autist herself. She gives herself a lot of grace for the times that she doesn't get things right, and by doing that she creates the right conditions for those PDA kids that she's raising to also learn that you can't expect people to get it right all the time. And I think that kind of expectation that people will be right all the time, and if they're not right, it's a huge injustice, is one of the black and white thinking models that really inhibits PDAs in the rest of the world. Learning to forgive other people for not being perfect is a huge thing that they need to do in order to function. So yeah,
well said. Thank you so much.
So, Marion, thanks for joining us. And for everyone else on the call, please make sure you connect in with Marianne on LinkedIn. She also runs some wonderful programs here on neurodiversity in Australia. I also did a blog series with Rebecca Cornmeal, who's one of our associates, who I'm not sure if is on the call tonight, that you can also access through LinkedIn, and Jay will make sure that you have access to that. But thank you again, everybody that stayed with us to the end. Thank you so much, Nancy. My son lives in London now, so I'm hoping to be back over very soon and hope to meet with you in person at that time.
Give me at least 2 months notice and you stand a chance. People who want to meet with me next week can almost never happen.
I'm hearing
All right.
That's all good. But thank you again for sharing your time with us this evening.
Oh, it's been my pleasure. Thank you very much.
Take good care.
Take care.
Good night, everybody.
Bye.
Thanks for joining us. She's gone.